Adrian Martin, are we in a state of critical failure when it comes to film?
Yes, we are. Maybe I could start with a story about someone who will be known to some of you, remembered by many of you, beloved of some of you, a wonderful guy named Ivan Hutchinson, who was an excellent film reviewer and was also a very expert musician. And in 1995, this is a moment I remember of encountering Ivan, and I encountered him in a record shop, in a music shop, before a screening, a media screening for us critics. And Ivan and I were both going through the CD racks, and we all know this experience. There are like dozens and dozens of CD soundtracks of films that neither he nor I had heard of. Films from all over the world that we hadn't heard of. And suddenly Ivan got very sad. And I said, "Ivan, what's wrong?" And he said, "Oh, it's not like the old days." He said, "In the old days, we critics saw everything before the public saw it, and we could sort it out for them, what was good and what was bad. And now I don't know what's out there anymore." And for me, that was a really historic moment, because the cinema, world cinema, past and present, is much bigger than what most reviewers deal with. The failure of criticism, of film criticism, is that it is a slave to the film industry, and I mean particularly the exhibition and the distribution industry. What's on at Hoyts and Greater Union and so on absolutely dictate what gets written about, at what length, and sometimes how it's written about in our mass media. That means that you'll always read a lot of stuff about Avatar and Inception, and it means that most of the important films being made in the world you will not read about or hear about anywhere in our press and in our media. That is the failure of criticism.
Well, quite clear. No doubt about it. Criticism has failed us. Let's get a view from a filmmaker. Gillian Armstrong is one of Australia's most successful directors. Gillian Armstrong, is film criticism failing us in Australia?
Well, I have to say that, I speak from 2 points of view. One, as a filmmaker whose work is criticised or valued or not, and also as a film lover and a person who reads reviews and wants to go to a movie as well. And firstly, I'd like to say that I can't say that it's completely failed, because we had the most wonderful views for Love, Lust and Lies, and the Melbourne audience were the smartest audience in Australia. We actually was box office records at the Nova, so I have to thank everyone in Melbourne now that I'm back here after our incredible run. I mean, truly a feature documentary that ended up having to have midnight sessions. It had so many sessions. So I thank both the very wonderful film critics in Melbourne and the audiences for that. But I have to say that I think I agree with Adrian, there has been a change in the last few years, and I find as both as a filmmaker and an audience member that I feel that film reviews are smaller. They seem to be lighter, less analytical. Quite often it's just a summary of the plot, which absolutely drives me crazy, both as an audience member and a filmmaker. I don't want my story given away. I've also noticed that a number of the critics, there seem to be fewer critics. The Melbourne Sunday paper critics are now in the Sydney Sunday papers. So, in mainstream, in the old-fashioned print media, there seem to be less. I suppose the thing that the counterbalance is you can now read a million websites and blogs, which is good for us as filmmakers, because if there are a few critics and they all hate your film, at least we want diversity. We want another avenue, some voice out there that tells people go and see it. And I noticed this year in the Sydney Film Festival a fantastically diverse range of people, and they're literally age group and sex and dress of the audience has changed from film to film. And I said to the director of the Sydney Film Festival, this is great, there's a lot of young people coming, and I don't understand how you're targeting. And then they said, it's online media, which was a wonderful thing to see, that it wasn't a lot of silver and grey haired people at the film festival.
So there are some positives.
So there are some positives.
Well, look, let's come to Mel Campbell now, because Gillian Armstrong, you've raised the issue of online writing, and Mel Campbell is a freelance journalist and cultural critic. Mel Campbell, do you see criticism failing, or is it getting a whole new life out there online?
Well, I think that Adrian and Gillian have both preempted some of the things that I would like to argue, is that there seems to be a lack of diversity in the mainstream media, but that it's been compensated for by the increased role of online media. But the quality does vary, and there's a fight going on at the moment among the old school who believe that bloggers and people for the newer, smaller online media are crap critics, that they do things badly, they just spend their whole reviews summarising the plot. But again, it's a sphere with lots of diversity in it, so I don't think that by any means there's a critical failure. One thing I would like to say is that the distribution problems that have been mentioned earlier by Adrian, the fact that the distributors still hold a stranglehold on who's allowed to go and see the films, who can preview them, and thus who has the commercial advantage of being able to have their reviews out before the film hits cinemas. I find that that's something that hasn't yet been really taken advantage of by online media. There still seems to be a lot of preponderance of old-fashioned media and broadcast media as well. So one thing I would like to see in future is for there to be more equitable access by the distributors for these newer outlets.
And everyone will set themselves up as a blogger and ask for free tickets.
Well, I think that there's professionalism and then there are hobbyists, and it's fairly easy to tell the difference between them, I think.
Fenella
Kernebone is probably best known to audiences as the presenter of Art Nation on ABC One. Before joining ABC TV, Fenella Kernebone was the host of The Movie Show on SBS television. Do you think we have a state of critical failure?
I think I'm somewhere in the middle between Adrian and Mel and Gillian as well. I think that yes, there is a failure in some cases in terms of the print media and also in the online world as well, because there is a lot of people simply just doing very short reviews. And I also do this for Limelight. I write 200 words, if that, for Limelight. There's not much you can say in terms of analysis in 200 words. And if you go online, as Mel was saying, that is also the case as well. But at the same time, I don't think that there's a critical failure because of the shift online. If you know where to go, if you search, of course online is oversaturated with people tweeting and blogging and commenting and YouTube, things like that. But if you know where to go, there are such a number of really erudite, intelligent critics out there who are writing long-form criticism. And for me, I think that means that having that intelligent debate available online and an archive of it as well from many, many decades, of course, is incredibly important. And it moves it on for me from simply being a conversation about Australian cinema to actually becoming a global conversation. So in part, I think it's because of the economic crisis, because there is a reduction. I mean, newspapers have to sell. So there is, in a sense, there's a bit of a dumbing down kind of factor going on with reviews. I know one person who writes for a magazine in particular, and they are only allowed to write reviews for this magazine that are positive. They can't write about a film that is negative, which I think is a terrible shame. But that's what's going on in print. But online, it's another world.
Let's interrogate that idea of the diversity of what's out there online versus, I suppose, the old-fashioned or the mainstream media with the authoritative voice, the established critic who you might go to each week. Adrian Martin, do you lament the loss of that, the breaking up of that establishment and sort of or is it compensated for by the diversity that Mel and Fenella have been talking about?
I don't think it's like necessarily such a clear-cut opposition between old-fashioned authority on the one hand and sort of anything goes diversity on the other. I do think it is important that there are voices of authority, and by that I don't mean someone with a university degree or someone who's done it for 50 years at Variety magazine or any of that nonsense. I just mean someone who in their encounter with the reader proves to the reader that they've got something worth reading or worth hearing or paying attention to. That is what authority is. When every
they're knowledgeable.
Yeah. And when every individual reader or listener says, well, that person's worth paying some attention to, not to follow them, not to negate them, but to sort of compare their own sensibilities with that critic. Now, what's happening online is that we are getting the rise of voices of people who probably could never get a job in some major newspaper or on television or on radio necessarily, but just through the force of the quality of their work, are able to start to begin to put together a readership around the world, as Fenella said. That's a very important thing. For a long time, film reviewing, all arts reviewing in this country, is so parochial. It's like a small town reviewing. It's what opens in Melbourne next week. Who cares about what opens in Melbourne next week when we can read about what's happening all over the world?
Well, and we now have the New York Times online or the New Yorker or whatever. I mean, all those, yeah.
And people around the world can read about what's happening in Melbourne this week. That's a whole change of the whole energy of reviewing.
Mel Campbell.
Yeah, that's right, Adrian. I think that as well, being able to access film reviews from all around the world gives you a sense that there's not just one way to do film criticism as well. There's a diversity of styles, writing styles among the critics, and that's one thing that I find particularly exciting. You can always find a critic who has an approach to film that you value and that you find really interesting, and you'll go back to them again and again, which is something that you might not have the luxury of doing if there's a certain critic who writes for your hometown newspaper, for instance, that you might not like them. I know that there are certain critics that my friends and my colleagues say if they like a film, I'll deliberately not go and see it, because I'm sure that in the audience everyone has their own ideas of such critics as well. And that's one thing that I love about the internet, is that it provides both fellow critics, me and my other critics, with models of how we can go about our craft, and also provides audiences with different ways to think about films.
I mean, for me, I've got to say, even though I do write short reviews for a magazine that comes out once a month, I actually don't read as many reviews per se as I used to, because I want to go and see the film first, and I want to form my own opinions, and I don't want to go along and say what's great about it and what's not, and that's the reason why I'm going to go see a film, which is kind of what you're talking about.
That's interesting, because that was going to be my question. There was so much out there. I mean, are you reading them before you see the film? Because
I find that I do.
Oh, that's really bad. I mean, for me as a creator, no, because you know,
I don't, Gillian. I try to see the film.
I mean,
first.
I don't. I mean, I literally put my hand over the middle of most reviews. I read the opening line to sort of suss out, well, you know, they think it's okay or not, and then I'll sort of read the last line of, I think you should go or not go. And apart from that, I actually would prefer to read them when I go home after.
Is that because you're worried the reviewer or the critic is going to give away the plot, or?
Yeah, even I really, I want to go as an audience member knowing as little as possible. I mean, if a word gets out about a film that I'm hearing people at a dinner party talking about, I've got to get to see this as soon as possible, because I want my viewing journey not to be coloured and prejudiced. It can be in a million ways. Yes, it can be a plot spoiler, or just there's some theme that I'm halfway through and then oh, that's right, the theme. Oh, of course this will happen.
Ruin the experience. Well, I must say I only watched Inception about 4 days ago, and that was a long time of me really avoiding any conversation or reading any criticism about this film, which everybody's talking about. And I knew that it had so much hype, but I just desperately didn't want to read a word about it. I vaguely knew the plot, and then I went and watched the film, and it was so much more fulfilling and enjoyable to then go in and read criticism from a variety, and it was only online. I didn't read anything in any newspaper.
Well, sure. I would like to draw a distinction, though, between the kind of hype that can be built up around films that isn't necessarily the review, but still gives you an idea of what the film might be about its themes and the way that you might want to approach it. There was an example in the Melbourne International Film Festival this year. There was a documentary showing called Catfish that the people involved with the film and the people promoting and distributing the film made it really clear that they did not want anyone to tell their friends what the film was about. Instead, they were just advised, go see the film. Personally, having seen the film, I really didn't think that it needed that degree of secrecy. Perhaps secrecy is itself a kind of hype strategy. But I don't believe in spoilers. I regularly read forward in Wikipedia to see what happens in my favourite TV shows, and I'll find out what happens in a plot of a film before I go and see it. So maybe I'm just a little odd.
The person that turns to the last page of the book before you read the novel.
Oddly, books are different. Films, for some reason.
Can I
Everybody's
suggest
got different ways of watching cinema, though, and reading about it.
That's right.
And can I suggest that as a panel, as people all engaged with film, you are probably not typical of the people who read film criticism. I mean, many people do read it to decide which film should they go and see. Now, there is a difference, of course, or I guess there's a difference between film criticism and film reviewing. Or are they the same
No,
thing?
I read it and I look at those dreadful stars as well. I mean,
3 out of 5.
We hate the star system, but I'm just as bad at saying, oh, someone's going to go 3, or they go 4, or it's got a few 4s. Maybe it is worth seeing. So,
But
I think there's a massive difference between criticism and reviewing, and I, for one, don't consider myself a film critic. Perhaps on the movie show in the past, having the opportunity to talk about film on a TV show that essentially is about getting ratings, you have 150 words to write a review, and then you have a small conversation afterwards, which you hope for a bit of argy-bargy. There's not much you can say, and again it gets down to there's not much space in order to have a proper critical conversation. Whereas I think that film criticism, and which is why it's so valuable, it doesn't matter about spoiler alerts, because I hope that the person writing about that film, and a lot of the time this is what great criticism is about, is that they explore the entire parameters of the film. They talk about how the film reflects on our world, the political and the social and the historical impact and the complexity, and that is incredibly important. And also you'd hope that they know heaps about the filmmaker itself and about the genre of the film. And that's kind of, you were talking about that before, Adrian, that to me is what criticism, real film criticism is all about.
And the question is then, where does that get published?
Well, I champion online as a venue for this. The Enthusiast in particular, we make a real point of publishing long-form essays about film. Our reviews are around 500 to 600 to 700 words. And again, maybe it's because I publish this sort of thing that I'm not worried about spoilers, but I think online is often thought of as a place for short soundbite type things, and particularly with certain places that I write for, they do emphasise short, snappy writing. But I think there's a place for long-form criticism definitely online.
I mean, once again, one of the critical failures that we're dealing with is that this supposed sort of quality arts press, and I'm talking about things like the Monthly and the Australian Literary Review and the Australian Book Review. Now, we're not reading hardly any good film criticism when they cover film. They get the same old literary people, trot them out, for their 1950s views of what the cinema is. I mean, this is garbage, right? I mean, it's such a failure, and it's been such a failure for 50 years, that this supposed, high arts culture has never taken film seriously enough and never invested enough in long-form criticism.
So, Adrian Martin, you're saying they do invest in that criticism when it comes to books and writing, but it's
the same old snobbery, absolutely the same as it's ever been. Books, there will always be 5 times more space for book reviews, and it'll always be, of course, a certain kind of book, high literary book, the literary event of the year, the Booker Prize, all the rest of it. Same old stuff, same old names, same old people reviewing those books. And books and theatre and opera and all that will always be thought of as more important than film. What century are we in, for Christ's sake?
Gillian Armstrong, do you...
Well, I was actually going to say, I think there still are some good analytical film reviewers in Australia that really have had something to say for many years, obviously including you, Adrian. Actually, if I may do a quite sidestep, I actually think the most shocking thing is the state of the reviewing of television, which is such a huge part of what we are all taking in, and it seems to there seems to be no real in-depth analysis of what we're seeing at all. It's all, most of them seem to write in a gag fashion. They have to turn it into some sort of lightweight comedy.
So, Gillian, are you speaking particularly about the newspaper coverage of TV?
The newspaper.
Well, maybe that's tied to the imperative to publish a TV guide and to be about just here's what's on TV this week. Maybe that's just not a good spot for it. And
no, in that sense, TV review, I completely agree with you on this, Gillian. TV reviewing is totally a slave to the TV schedule and to the TV, distribution industry, as it were. And I can hardly think of, I can think of 2 TV reviewers that I've liked in 20 years. Philippa Hawker and Delia Falconer in a recent issue of the Monthly. And they're the only people I thought were treating television with the seriousness that some of us treat film.
Adrian Martin, I want to ask you why you stopped writing film criticism for newspapers.
I quit reviewing, and I'm not about to return to it either, and I'll tell you why. I worked for a newspaper called The Age. And The Age became a really terrible place to work for. And a lot of that was because there was a series of commercial economic imperatives that were impacting very directly and very powerfully on what I was writing. And there were, directives to me, We need less on these silly little art films that no one's seen, and we need a lot more on the new Tom Cruise movie because there's a big ad for the Tom Cruise movie. And in fact, the people who made and are distributing the Tom Cruise movie are going to pull their ads if this doesn't get a real big and hopefully a very positive review. This is the kind of stuff that was basically being said to me, And I had an experience, it was one of the last experiences I stood for at The Age, where for a little while, Philippa Hawker and myself had a Wednesday space where we could speak very freely and openly about what to us were the real events in film in Melbourne. For instance, the Melbourne Cinematheque on a Wednesday night. Jacques Demy retrospective, Samuel Fuller, whatever it was, Russian retrospective. And we got half a page to talk about that, to rave about that, and to try to get people along to that, more people along to that. That was our free space for a blessed few months. And suddenly there was a wonderful night where a certain editor rang me and said, OK, we're going to pull that stuff because we're going to try to get the jump on the other newspapers, and we've got to have a big review of the new Oliver Stone film in that spot. So we're scrapping all that stuff and we're going to start publishing Wednesday reviews. And it was like, is this for real? I've suddenly got to write a longer piece on Oliver Stone's Alexander than the career of Jacques Demy. I wasn't going to stand for that. And those sorts of pressures were basically making film reviewing more and more trivial.
But there is, the newspapers are in a real bind. The traditional revenue that enabled people like you to be employed to write lengthy criticism, the rivers of gold through classified advertising, they're drying up. And there's no replacement model to fund the kind of writing you want to do. We have to be serious about this. Newspapers and TV are never really been the space for quality, long-form, intelligent, intellectual criticism. Every now and then a window opens up and there's someone like Pauline Kael in The New Yorker, or there's someone who manages to get a bit of a berth for a while. But that's always a miracle, basically, a short-lived miracle. Mainly the history of the mass media is absolute mediocrity and completely tied into every capitalistic thing that we hate, right? And that's the fact of it. Real film criticism happens elsewhere. It has always happened elsewhere. It happens in small magazines. Now it happens on the internet magazines, blogs, whatever. I think we do the internet a disservice by always calling everything that's there a blog, right?
Absolutely.
But there are also, journals, magazines, academic journals. There's a lot of stuff on the net. And that's where the home of film criticism has always been. Right? It's there rather than in the mass media, and in a way it's a kind of a waste of our time to be saying, oh, why can't we have better reviews in The Age? The Age is, forget The Age. I did. I won't read it anymore, you've got to look elsewhere, and that's the challenge of the internet, is to dive in, and not just blindly, but to find kind of the aggregating sites that are pointing you in interesting directions. Just to name one, there's a wonderful website called Film Studies for Free, done by a person named Catherine Grant, and every day or two she has a topic. Films of Michael Haneke, and she gives you 20 really good links to the 20 best things written on the net about Michael Haneke. Now that's what criticism is, right? And that's a good guide to criticism. That's what we need, is the navigation. We need the guide, not just the sea of supposedly 2 million bloggers out there.
But Gillian Armstrong, as a filmmaker, don't you still need those reviews in The Age or whatever other newspaper it may be to tell that general public?
We do, and I'm quite shocked to find out about that bias. Maybe I was naive. It's interesting because I've actually noticed over the last few years, sometimes there'll be even in the layout of the page, the most positive review may be about more of an art house film, but the another more commercial film, which was actually panned, it was the one that got the giant picture and the giant headline. I think, why are they doing that? This other film, which is obviously, if you really read it, was fantastic. It didn't get the headline. It didn't get the big picture. It just got a little pocket in the corner. And now I find out it's all dreadful.
It's a rigged game.
Commercial. I'm shocked.
Do the reviews and does criticism, Gillian, does it matter to your films, or will quality succeed?
Oh no. no, it really, really matters.
You've had bad experiences, obviously.
No, all my films have been loved by everybody. But I've got a lot of sympathy for the other filmmakers. No, especially Australian films. You know, we already know that we're in an art house category. So the people that go and see our films, and also there's been such, there's really been the dreadful lack of confidence in Australian films in the last 10 years or so. So people are incredibly nervous about stepping into Australian film, and so they read those reviews. So no, they are very, very important, and you're made or destroyed, absolutely, by a bad review.
Fenella Kernebone, does that mean the critic owes perhaps a duty of care to the local industry of some sort? I mean, is there a place for a bit of cultural advocacy, given, you know, the low budgets that Australian filmmakers work with, you know, the kind of fragility of the local industry?
I don't know, this one really confuses me, because I think about how we're all encouraged to go Australian made, you know, go and eat Australian cornflakes and, you know, have Australian oranges and don't import all this kind of stuff. And here we are in a culture where we go, yeah, Australian's fantastic, and yet there is a reticence to go along and see Australian cinema, which I think is a real shame. So yes, should the critic then support the Australian film in exactly the same way? I really wonder about that, because as Gillian's saying, the critic can actually really damage an Australian film. It can stop people to go and see it. So it can be incredibly damaging what it is that they end up saying. So I would hope that a critic or a reviewer attempted to be impartial. That's what I would hope. But I don't think that happens.
You hope that they'll be fair. I mean,
yeah.
Look, you know, like any filmmaker, I want a good review and I want people to go and see my film. But as an audience member, I absolutely believe that the critic has to be fair. They've got to trust their own gut reaction. I don't think they should have a bias. But at the same time, in Australia, you know, they're carrying so much baggage when they go and see an Australian film. I mean, they really are. I've had so many reviews over the years that have literally been about what they think I should be doing for the Australian film industry. They actually haven't walked in with an open mind to judge my film. I mean, you know, I can go back over many of them. Starstruck. One reviewer was, why is she making this lightweight piece of frippery, because there's a lot of youth issues out there, and it would be much better if the film was about unemployed youth. You know, I would rather it be judged on, did it work as a lightweight piece of frippery or not?
That's right.
And there's, you know, there's so much consciousness about what sort of films we should be making, and, you know, there's been the last 3 years that they've all got caught up in this thing, all the films are depressing, and, you know, and then there's the thing about comparing apples with oranges. There's been a dreadful thing that's entered criticism around the world, which is talking about the box office success of a film. That should have nothing to do with whether the film is good or bad. I mean, I actually was talking to an international film distributor, and he said, you know, they're so mean to the Australian films, and why are they comparing, in some roundup of how our films went over the year, you know, they're comparing apples with oranges. You know, they were damning Black Balloon, which was the most successful film of whatever it was 3 years ago, and comparing its box office to, yes, some sort of Mission Impossible. And they said, but actually, it was an art house film, and in the art house world, it did very well. It did better than Milk, you know. So, someone told me an interesting thing. They said that in the Danish film industry, the similar thing was going on, that there was a whole sort of sense of, you know, we're tearing our hearts out about what films they should be making. And someone said, maybe you should just stop. Don't talk about our industry at all. And just let us go and see, you know, review the films, but stop talking about what we should be doing, not doing, whether we're succeeding or failing. And actually, things just actually bubbled along, and people started going back to Danish films. Maybe we should do that here.
Mel Campbell, how do you decide which films you're going to write about? I mean, you work for 2 different online publications, The Enthusiast, which is, as you describe it, The Enthusiast, and, you know, where you publish longer form reviews and so on, and then the Thousands, which is a city guide where you do more like capsule reviews of 200 words. So do you review different films for those different online sites, or you write different types of reviews for them?
Different types of reviews, I think. The Enthusiast is a very omnivorous website. We'll review the trashiest film, we'll review the most art house film, we'll review obscure films and absolute blockbusters. Whereas 3000 being the Melbourne arm, which is where I mainly work, and then my content is syndicated to the various other thousands around Australia, they have a very specific target market. They're kind of a young, cool target audience, and so when I review for them, I have to think, will the people that read 3000 and the various other thousands be interested in this kind of thing? We tend to cover a lot of art house stuff, so Gillian, you'd be happy to see that, but we also cover lots of popcorn things. We cover kiddie films because our readers will be nostalgic about them. We cover popcorn films because people might have them as a guilty pleasure. So, but it always has to be viewed through the prism of the kind of film that our readers would like to display to their friends that they're going to see.
Does cultural nationalism come into it at all, in the sense of, do you say, well, this is an Australian film and we need films about us, and so we ought to at least, go and see it and give it a review, or is that completely
Well, to be
irrelevant?
honest, actually, if something is trumpeted as being an Australian film, it will put me off. I don't like it when films are pushed for their Australianness, but if they're a good film or a bad film, that's the way I'll review them. For instance, Tomorrow When the War Began, which is this really big budget for an Aussie film, push
based on John Marsden's
based on these
children's
beloved
novels. Yep.
children's novels, just came out on Thursday. And there's been a lot of debate about that. Was it like Neighbours and Home and Away go to Vietnam, or, all these ridiculous sort of analogies. I just liked that film as an experience in itself, but I know that other people felt this resentment that they had to experience it and to filter their reviews through the prism of it being Australian and it being beloved. There are some terrific Aussie films that I've seen. Two that just stand out for me are Samson and Delilah, which was just extraordinary, and Animal Kingdom, which was also extraordinary. Two very different films, both Australian and both of interest to our readers. So that's the reason why I covered them, not because they were Australian. And then there are all sorts of terrible Australian films. This is my pet peeve about Australian filmmaking. Why do they persist in making these appalling low-budget splatter horror films that are just so indistinguishable from one another? They all involve a group of young, pretty people going into the outback and getting murdered by either a psycho or some force of nature. I hate those films.
Because those boys that made Saw became multimillionaires.
And everyone sees that as the model now. Yeah. And I think that's really unfortunate.
Well, also, I think that's a terrible wish that the only reason you want to make film is because you're going to be a multimillionaire, so it doesn't matter what the content is and how sadistic. And so, from my point of view, but then you've got to have diversity. But there is a push at the moment, which is very worrying, that that genre pictures are now, that's the latest theory that's going to save the industry. And actually, there can never be any rule except making something that's good and that's original. That should be.
But there's no space for genre pictures. There's no space at all for splatter movies in Australia. I kind of disagree.
There's space for them, but they have to be amazing.
There's space for them.
These are bad ones.
There's space for them, but I think that it's the fact that they're all so similar that irks me so much. And there's really not much effort taken to say, how is this different from the last splatter film that we made, or the last psychopath, going on the spree movie that we made. I really think that Australia needs to make more rom-coms for a start, and there's been a couple of efforts this year, not very good ones, to make romantic comedies in Australia, but I'm not saying that I'm anti-genre cinema, and I think that Australia tends to be caught in this art house thing where we need to tell Australian stories, and we don't really, we're obsessed with this idea of telling small domestic stories, and I apologise because I know you have told quite a few of them.
No, I've actually done a lot of huge period films. The small domestic stories, it's because there's no money to make a film. That's been part of the reason that there's been a lot of very low-budget Australian films, because that's all people could afford to make.
Well, like you were just saying,
it should never limit imagination.
Exactly. You can make a wonderful creative film that's a small story.
Absolutely.
One that I really loved this year was Accidents Happen, which was an interesting thing because it was not an Australian story. Everyone put on a fake American accent. But it was a lovely story, well told. And the same with The Black Balloon that you mentioned earlier. I loved that film. I thought it was fantastic.
Yeah, we'd all wish that the Australian bit would be taken off the title. I thought, especially with Oscar and Lucinda, I literally thought maybe if I just subtitled it and didn't put my name on it, it just would have been judged completely differently.
Fenella, Kernebone, what about the savage review, the absolute kind of, writing where you say, you really go for the jugular? I mean, do you ever write that sort of review and you think that sort of review is there a place for it?
There is a place for it, but you have to be able to justify your argument. So yeah, you can have a savage review. I don't do that. I don't have the opportunity to do that anymore.
So if you really hate a film, will you just not review it?
No, I'll review the film, but I hope that within my 150 words, I've got the ample space in order to somehow. I think you have to be able to balance it, and maybe Adrian can probably talk about this as well. But to savage a film entirely without having space to really communicate your ideas, I find a massive problem, and I think that's what you get a lot of on the internet as well, is this kind of, it's like tweeting or something like that. You can say it's shit or it's good, and that's pretty much all you've got. It's awesome, it's bad, and that's, unless you've got the space to do it.
There's definitely reviewers that like the sound of their own adjectives.
But I mean,
and cynicism.
There is, Adrian, or there should be, a serious difference between criticism and opinion.
Yeah, well, and for me, the difference, opinion in itself is kind of worthless. Like, simply an assertion of an opinion is nothing. I say I like it, you say I don't like it. Well, so what? We just walk away and we disagree. But criticism is all about, well, it's just what Fenella says, backing up what you're saying, giving a context for arguing it out.
It's about really good writing, like seriously writing and then rewriting, and that's what real criticism is. And to be honest, I doubt very much whether reviewers who do short capsule reviews will spend days and days, weeks and weeks, actually channeling their argument and really refining it. And I think that's what's incredibly important about film criticism, which is why it's a shame that I don't get to wake up anymore on a Saturday morning and to read really great criticism in the paper, because that's a lot of fun. Instead, now I've got to open up my laptop and search for it. You need electricity for that.
Well, we've talked about print and we've talked about online. What about radio and television? Fenella, you work in television. Is it possible to do serious criticism on TV or on the radio?
I thought the sad one that's gone was Peter Thompson, that was on the Sunday program. He was, and actually his theory was always, I'm only going to do a film that I like. And then I will go into it and in great depth about why and so on. I think that's been very sad that was canned. They have nothing at all now.
Yeah, I think I agree with you about that. But in my experience, in television, it's been pretty much the same and in radio as well since I started. And I'm 34 now, so in radio on Triple J, it was having, on when I did Artery on Triple J, it was having someone coming in, Megan Spencer coming in and talking about film and reviewing it for a youth audience. And then on the television, it's pretty much the same thing. You can talk for a little while, and then you can have a little conversation about it. And Margaret and David have the same kind of issues here as well. So and then the rest of it is capsule reviews. It's about entertainment. If you watch the commercial channels, it's simply about providing entertaining content. And I don't think that that's changed remarkably. There have been a loss of programs over the years, which I think is a shame. Some shows have tried it and it hasn't worked, which I also think is a shame, because it works with politics and current affairs, like Q&A works perfectly. But I wonder why it doesn't work so well with talking about art and film, which disappoints me greatly because I love talking about that kind of stuff. And I think half of the problem is because people think that art is a dirty word and that film is a dirty word.
Well, I have to say it's shocking that the ABC think that art is a dirty word.
I don't.
And they've thrown away. Their arts program have stopped and started. It's on Sunday, it's not allowed to be in grown up time, and they're still running the bill, and we'd all be happy for.
But this is where I go back to the old concept. There is actually.
They can have Sunday art. They can have Sunday arts on. When is the bill on?
But Saturday night, the thing is, I don't even watch television like everybody else does. I bet everybody here has watched, True Blood and The Wire and all that kind of stuff. Have they actually watched it on TV, or have they been watching it on DVD, or downloading it illegally? That happens a lot more. And to watch arts programs. I watch a lot of these things online, and that's where you can get it's the same as reviewing and great criticism. You can go online and see great content whenever you like it, and I think that's incredibly important. And that's where you can see Art Nation too.
As well as on television.
Yes, exactly.
Sorry, Fenella, I was just going to add that I think one of the great things that broadcast can do is discussion. The way that we're just having our discussion here, and we can tease out the issues between us, and yeah, like Adrian mentioned, the differences of opinions can actually turn into criticism.